Hi, um, my name is Andrew Gardner. Welcome back to my lecture series that I put on YouTube amidst the pandemic. I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. And again, this is part of a lecture series that I have been beginning to put online where I revisit a variety and a constellation of different issues, some that are very new and of interest to me, and other ones that actually mining some older papers in my academic production. Today, the title of the lecture that I'm giving is Anthropology, American Anti-Racism, and Imperialism. And this particular lecture actually begins at the point where my paper and one of the previous lectures that I've put up here on YouTube ends. And that's the lecture or the paper entitled Imperial Diversity. I'm sort of beginning with that point. So if you haven't seen or read that particular piece, it would be informative and perhaps useful to start with that before you get to the lecture today. Okay, so also as I typically try to do, I like to begin these lectures with an abstract that provides, in written form, a sort of quick overview of what you can expect and what you'll see in the lecture for today. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the discipline of anthropology and the legacy of American imperialism. After discussing that for a bit, I'll point to some of the places that I think that imperialism is still active and even vibrant in today in the contemporary world. And I question near the end of this lecture whether anthropologists and perhaps others ought to be more concerned about this imperialism than they seem to be. So with that out of the way, we can sort of proceed through these slides, and I'll have a little bit more of an introduction here as well. So the pandemic has been particularly limiting for anthropologists and ethnographers who are primarily concerned and focused on other peoples, other ways of being in this world, and those other people's words, right? This is sort of the ethnographic way, is this interaction with the social world out there. I thought I'd begin, in lieu of that, I thought I'd begin this talk today with some of these comments that I cherry-picked from a Reddit piece that went around in August, a few months ago of 2020. And this was a set of responses to the question, what is your genuine reaction to what's going on in America right now? And all of these were penned by foreigners. So we're talking about foreigners' perspectives on contemporary America in August of 2020. And I'm just going to read through these. The U.S. always appeared like an older, stronger brother. Now it feels like this brother started using meth. I'm from Afghanistan, said another writer. That shit don't faze me. I'm from India. We got problems too. I live in the asshole of the world, Bosnia, Balkan, and it seems like America just hit puberty. Another writer says, from Brazil, our president would drink Trump piss. Another one says, you're so busy flinging shit at each other that you can't see the mess you've made. Yet another says, I'm a bit sick of hearing about it, to be completely honest. And then in reply to him or her, you and I both. Sometimes it's like the rest of the world doesn't even matter. And another response, so many Americans just can't handle a view that's different to their own, or at least allow others to have a different view. Crazy. And then finally someone writes, I'm sick of bringing American problems to my country. Also, people Americanizing the discourse to our existing debates. And so with those comments in mind, I'll be coming back to those, but I also just wanted to use them to kind of frame some of the points that I'm going to be making today. And I want to orient us a little bit for this lecture. So first of all, I want to recognize that anthropology, and the discipline of anthropology, its traditional focal point is outside the home, right? The foreign world. And traditionally, considering that this discipline, like all academic disciplines, was primarily crafted in the Western European and North American tradition, anthropology was traditionally concerned with what we might call non-Western cultures and societies. On that note, sort of talking about what's happening here in America, or we might even transpose that for anthropologists to talk about things happening in their own country, is not really anthropology's forte. Yet, nonetheless, that in some ways is what I'm going to be talking about today. So anthropology is a discipline that's really been configured around the exploration of otherness. And it's developed a methodological toolkit that's configured around developing empathy and understanding for that difference. If you look at the legacy of anthropology, that's really the sort of experience that it's been crafted around. Now, interestingly, via the concept of culture, anthropology precariously balances its estimation and interest in cultural difference and difference in general with simultaneously its belief in the universal sort of planetary humanism. And here I'm using Paul Gilroy's term. But anthropologists, just to be clear, at the same time believe that we humans are all cut from the very same cloth, right? Yet at the same time are very concerned with the differences that we conjure via culture, right? And so that's the kind of balance that anthropology seeks. I'll say that those final comments in that Reddit slide that I just read, the ones concerned with how American ideas are pervading other discourses and shaping sort of our problems in America or shaping other people's problems, those are some of the points that I'm particularly concerned with here, as they resonate with many of the things that I've been hearing before my travel was sort of hemmed in because of the pandemic. The kinds of things that I'm hearing from my contacts, friends, and the people that I interact with, mostly in the Middle East and South Asia, but I'd also say in Japan and Singapore and Africa and other places that are part of my cosmopolitan network. And so finally, to be clear, the discipline to which I've devoted my life, anthropology, the anthropology that I encountered and enthusiastically joined, 25 years ago, it attracted me because of its foundational respect for difference, its commitment to the collection of first-hand evidence, and its sustained commitment to anti-imperialism. I want to linger for a moment on that very last point, anthropology's political commitment and sustained political commitment to anti-imperialism. I want to think about that with a couple of examples from anthropological history. And so the first sort of chapter that I want to get to when thinking about anthropology's sort of history of anti-imperialism, there are, of course, earlier chapters, but the chapter that I want to talk about today concerns modernization theory. And modernization theory was an ideological package of ideas that was cultivated in academia in the early 1960s, in that sort of post-war flush of activity. And one that was sort of crafted in academia with notable assistance from the Ford Foundation and some other granting foundations and institutions as well. So modernization theory was a set of ideas incorporating economic organization, political structures, and systems of societal values. And that's a quote from Latham, who sort of put it that way. And this package of ideas is notably sort of configured by Walt Rostow, the man you see here on the screen, who evidently went to Yale when he was only 15 years old. Modernization theory was very notably sort of syncopated with the machinery and the weaponry of state, of the American state. And these kinds of ideas that other nations can and should be encouraged to develop in the same path that we sort of envisioned our American past comprising. We were trying to usher other countries along this same path. And that was all sort of a strategy that was fulfilled or sort of delineated by this modernization theory, Walt Rostow's modernization theory. And so anthropology played a key role in sort of asserting the problematic and deleterious impacts of this imperialist American ideological package. A set of ideas, again, that were crafted and sort of formulated in academia. And anthropology spent a lot of time thinking about the impact of these ideas and these kinds of economic and social changes on the diversity of other cultures in the world. That was a fight that the men and women who taught me in graduate school had been involved in when they were younger. And so this fight, in many ways, this anti-imperialist commitment of anthropology had concluded by the time that I was in graduate school in the 1990s. But that brings us to the chapter of anti-imperialism that I did join when I joined anthropology in the 90s. And that was the sort of movement against neoliberalism, and particularly for me, American neoliberalism. So the young men that you see here are known as the Chicago Boys. These are the Latin American economists that were trained at the University of Chicago by Milton Friedman and his acolytes. And again, interestingly, and reading up on this, found that the Ford Foundation, again, sort of played a role in helping these exchanges and movements of students and these programs sort of prosper and promulgate these kinds of ideas. So many of these young men went on to control key positions and policies in Chile and Mexico and Argentina and Brazil and a variety of other places in Latin America. And then via some other outposts of this kind of neoliberal economic policy at like Berkeley, for example, the Berkeley Mafia, as it was called, helped sort of shuttle these ideas to Indonesia and other places as well. So here again, we see the university playing a very sort of key role in cultivating and then disseminating these kinds of ideas that to me then, and certainly to many of us in retrospect, have a very imperialistic sort of whiff to them, an American sort of imperialism. And I would also note, as per the last slide, again, neoliberalism very syncopated with the machinery and the weaponry of state. We could blame sort of the Gulf War in part on these sorts of neoliberal thinking. So the anthropology that I joined was very much sort of oriented towards rolling back these kinds of impacts, or at least testifying to the impacts of neoliberal change on the diversity of cultures around the world and the variety of different peoples that, anthropologists work with. I'll also note, with our election only 3 days away here in America, that this neoliberal sort of ideology really commenced certainly with President Reagan, and has been a central feature in the sort of ideological packages that all American presidents have brought to the candidacy. And that includes the two choices that Americans currently have for our next president, all of which are going to continue this sort of neoliberal era in America. It was interesting to me in doing the research for these two slides and just sort of pulling this information together that the Ford Foundation was present in both of the stories, first of modernization theory and then neoliberalism. And I thought it would be interesting for me to go see what the Ford Foundation is up to today. And so here, take a look at the Ford Foundation's homepage that I went and looked at last week. So I want to talk briefly, thinking about this, about some of the conduits of American imperialism as I see them. I was obviously surprised to see that the Ford Foundation and other foundations had played such a central role in facilitating both modernization theory and neoliberalism. So let me be clear of what I'm getting at here. Through my long and sustained work outside of America, in the Gulf states, on the Arabian Peninsula, in South Asia, with colleagues in Singapore and Japan and Europe and West Africa, I've become convinced that we are amidst another chapter of American imperialist history. Like neoliberalism and like modernization theory before it, the paradigm at the root of this contemporary imperialism is being cultivated in the American university system. Universities like mine, the one that employs me, with some of the most privileged humans on earth. And here I'm thinking of myself and my students at a private liberal arts institution in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. The idea, this package of ideas, is what in my previous lecture and presentation I call the diversity paradigm in the paper that I suggested to you. But it encapsulates an ontology that underpins wokeness, anti-racism, intersectionality, and really the entirety of what I would call the identitarian social prism, which I see as now the sort of contemporary style of thinking in American academia. And I'll note, thinking here again about the sort of the Ford Foundation, but also about modernization theory and neoliberalism, none of these ideological packages were interested in trying to understand difference in this world, right? All of them are very much sort of oriented towards engineering particular kinds of change in the world. And right away, I see some frictions between the sort of traditional mission of anthropology and some of the ideas that are woven into this identitarianism and its anti-racist manifestations on campus today. All right. So on this slide, I want to talk a little bit in a little bit more detail about what I see as the mode of projection. How are these ideas being projected and promoted out in the world? And here, I want to convey that I have come to really think of the American higher education system as the last robust institutional vestige of American imperialism. I do think there's a good case to be made for this, and I think it's likely that many in my audience, that of everyone in the audience, or at least many in my audience, that I have probably, on the higher end, more experience, firsthand experience in this sort of global higher system of higher education, having worked in the Middle East and traveled in a variety of places around the Indian Ocean world as part of my research. And it's through those experiences that I've really come to sort of grapple with this ideological projection of what we might call America's ontological imperialism that occurs through this higher education system. This relates to what the urban theorist Saskia Sassen has called command functions. And so when she looks at power in the contemporary world system, she's very interested in the places, and indeed oftentimes cities, where the sort of command and regulation of flows sort of occurs. And I think the education system is certainly a node in the sort of command function in that sense. But to be a little more specific, where do I see this happening? I see this hegemony being maintained and extended through the syllabuses that professors design, often American professors, through the conference topics at international conferences, through the publication themes that are established by journals and publishers, many of which are based in North America and Europe, in the publication themes that they design, in the book awards that various global and international societies give away, including 2 different international committees on which I've recently served, via the grants and research funds that hand out money for research, and then via the foreign students who take degrees at American universities and institutions, or even at the satellite campuses that I'm also very much attuned to here. And then through the topics and themes that American students bring to study abroad programs, for example, in those students successful, clamoring for safe spaces, their concerns for microaggressions, their interest in conveying to foreigners that names should be accompanied by preferred pronouns. So all of that, and really more comprehensively via the media sphere that I think America remains centrally sort of positioned in, all of that sort of reaches back to American campus and campus culture. And so here again, I'm returning to an image of American campus, not as a place that's reflective of the society around it, but actually a place that's in, and here again, thinking about modernization theory and thinking about neoliberalism as a generative force, right? As a part of American society that's generating, cultivating, and promulgating a particular set of ideas. So on this slide, you can see some pictures. This is one of the satellite campuses on the left, Carnegie Mellon, I think, in Doha, in Qatar. And then on the same sort of set of campuses, that's the Weill Cornell Medical School, also in Qatar. And there's me and some of my students from Qatar University. So on the next slides, I want to talk, on these next slides, I want to point a little bit to some of the specific places where I've been able to, where I think I've been able to see the kinds of impacts of this American imperialism taking root. And so the first place that I'll talk about is really the subject of that previous presentation, or at least part of the topic that I cover there on imperial diversity. And that has to do with the slavery, as it's colloquially called, the Slavery Museum, that was constructed and designed mostly by North American, but largely by Western sort of museum designers in Qatar. And as I've argued in that paper, and I'll briefly mention again here, I think that that museum very much took American ideas, an American social prism, as I call it, and sort of imposed it on a different sort of cultural setting. So in some ways, sort of pulling the post-abolition integration of those Qataris who trace their lineage to African slaves, to take their integration from its cultural and social matrix indigenous to Qatar via families, clans, and tribes, and really moving it towards more of an American model that's focused on the individual and his or her identity, while simultaneously sort of marginalizing discussions and thought of other sources of slaves, which would include the substantial Baluchi population that's also a part of the citizenries of all of the Arab societies. I pulled this picture off the internet as an example, and just to be clear, what I'm basically arguing is that by imposing this American understanding of race and difference and identity on a place like Qatar, we're taking this group of 4 young Qatari men, and we are asserting that one of them is a different sort of citizen, right? And that special concern and ideas and thought need to be directed at that one of these 4 young men. Now, in a recent paper that's currently out for review, I've also been talking about another place where I think some of the baggage of this American thinking about our social prism, essentially, how it's shaping the way we assess sort of urban space in foreign cities. And so in this picture, we're actually in a place called Asian Town, which is an enclave, and we might also call it a segregated space in the urban landscape of Doha. although people can come and go from it, but it's a place where migrant foreigners, most of whom come from South Asia, are placed to dwell during their, 2, 4, 6 years that they spend working in Qatar. I think, in my experience, many of the critiques that are levied against these kinds of discrete and clearly nationalist and ethnic and racial zones in the landscape of the city, that Americans have a particular kind of concern and antipathy towards these kinds of segregated spaces, and that sort of antipathy permeates the way that we, cosmopolitan urban scholars, sort of think about these places. And this came to me particularly because the critiques that I see Western scholars levying against these kinds of segregated spaces are not at all the sorts of things that I hear from the men who dwell in these spaces. And so there's a real disconnect between that lived experience and then the perspectives of scholars and Westerners critiquing them. The last sort of place that I can talk about somewhat coherently in terms of how this American social prism, diversity prism, is impacting other places and other conversations out there in the world came up in this article that I read with my students in Introductory to Anthropology. And this is Scott McKeerchern, a physical anthropologist, writing about race and how race has fit in anthropology. And I'll read this quote. He says, "American definitions and American relations of race are not necessarily universal, although the power of the United States today means that social and cultural debates about race around the world are increasingly debated using American meanings." So here again, I mean, his point, even at the very foundations of how we're thinking and talking about race, our very ideas about race, this is part of the kind of imperial American imposition that I'm attuned to in this particular lecture. So, in this paper and in this presentation, I've suggested, and the one that I suggested as a preface to this lecture, I articulate the notion that this imperialism can be envisioned in terms of a social prism. And in this case, in the American case, a hegemonic mode of gauging, categorizing, and organizing human difference. It is an identitarian paradigm grounded in notions of race, ethnicity, and the individual. And you can also see the concretization of democratic and indelibly American historical relations in this social prism. And a lot of that, I think, is also distilled in the intersectionality paradigm that we have discussed in previous conversations and lectures in my department. And so all of that I sort of see as the key components of what we might think of not only as the imperial imposition of this American social prism, as I call it, and again, what I mean by a social prism is a way of taking the constellation or the continuity of difference that humans present everywhere in the world and chopping it up and categorizing it, right? In the same way that a prism would take light and divide it into its components of color, a social prism takes that continuum of human difference and divides it and categorizes it and organizes it. That's also why in this presentation I'm thinking of this as a kind of ontological imperialism. And ontology is the portion of philosophy that includes sort of attention to the categories of knowledge. And it's really those categories that I think are the essential components of the social prism that I'm talking about here. So, I see anthropology as the academic discipline that attempts to step around the human penchant for ethnocentricity, right? Ethnocentricity being that human impulse to see the world through the cultural lens that we've grown and developed naturally in our own culture. In anthropology, our academic mission is to try to understand how others see the world, how others experience and understand the world. So to try as best we can to step around the ethnicities that all of us as humans with culture bring to our understandings. In anthropology, we've developed a method and a tradition of trying to step around our own sort of ethnocentricities and to understand that difference. And so the question that I asked many of my students and some of my colleagues when I presented this lecture in public the other day on campus is, is it not true that the campus-based American anti-racism movement comprises a latent demand that anthropology at my university be more American? Doesn't it imply that we should disregard these ontological diversities to promote an American racial understanding of difference? Isn't anthropology being asked to publicly demonstrate its fealty to an American social prism? Those are questions that I'm tussling with in my own mind as an American with a commitment to anti-racism. These are sort of questions that point to some of the tensions that I think are in my own sort of being as an anthropologist and an American at this moment. And so this really does remind me of this quote from Slavoj Zizek. What if the way that we perceive a problem is already part of the problem? In essence, I think what he's pointing to and what I'm also sensing here is that in some ways, with anti-racism, the anti-racism movement in America, we are actually manufacturing, strengthening, and promulgating the idea of race, the very concept that it purports to disdain. I mean, anti-racism. And so, again, what Slavoj says, what if the way that we perceive the problem is already part of the problem? So, quickly, I was staring at my bookshelf in my office, which you see here the other day, and thinking about identitarianism. And I mean, identitarianism, this constant focus on identity and thinking about each other, and a social prism that's really grounded in identity thinking. This is something that in my experience really came about in the last, really in my career as an anthropologist. We did not talk about identity in the same way 20 years ago or with nearly as much frequency 20 years ago as we do now. And I was thinking about sort of identitarianism as kind of one of the ways that I might phrase this as kind of the core, the foundation of the problem that I see. In my mind, as a sort of analogy, I think identitarianism tells us that we should judge none of these books by the content. It's not the words inside these books and how well they're crafted that matters in terms of how we think about this book and how we gauge or judge this book. And certainly we all know that we're not supposed to judge books by its cover, but I think identitarianism also steers us away from gauging a book by its cover either, right? Instead, as an analogy, I think what identitarianism does is it asks us to sort of place, judge, or understand a book by its call letter, right? So these giant identitarian categories are essentially these call letters. And I recognize with my colleagues who are very invested in sort of intersectionality that those call numbers are no longer just one or two of these letters, but there's this increasing complexity of perhaps thinking with several of these variables at once. If that somehow addresses the fact that identitarianism steers our assessment away from the content of the book, or, as through the analogy, from the content of the individual, him or herself, and steers us toward these sorts of categorical understandings. So I put up this slide of many of the people who have inspired me in this thinking. I owe a great debt to all of them, and none of them are responsible for these ideas, especially if you don't like them. None of them are responsible for these ideas, but I'd like to put all of these faces up here as I sort of move to my next point. I'll also note that in my experience, these are, I'm looking at their faces right now, just a constellation of great, important, vital, invaluable sorts of intellects here. Yet, I would say that the average student on a campus like mine, immersed in the world of ideas as they're supposed to be on a liberal arts campus, is probably getting through 4 years of undergraduate study being assigned none of these authors or writers. I have found ways to fit some of these writers into my classes, but I would really say that that would be highly unusual. I think most students get through university these days in a very sort of homogenous sort of set of readings that don't include any of these people. So what I'm suggesting here, and this is sort of my moving towards my provocative conclusion, what I'm suggesting here is that you join me in an effort to truly decolonize anthropology, and perhaps to decolonize American academia before its global hegemony is fully solidified. The colonialists aren't people that we ferret out and deplatform or otherwise shun. Rather, I think that we need to simply look in the mirror as academics, or in this case, we academics simply need to look at our Zoom screens at some of the meetings and classes that we're in. We need to look at ourselves and develop a much stronger sense of tolerance for those with values, perspectives, and intellectual traditions that differ from those that we Americans hold dear. We need to recognize our values and our differences, not as universal, but foremost as American. So I'm pleading with anyone, any of you Americans who are listening, and anyone who's really interested, let's join together to manifest the post-racial, intellectually diverse, cosmopolitan world of connection and difference that lies before us. The American emphasis on a particular and problematic conception of race is not the fabric by which the world ought to be woven together. Actually, we Americans should be listening and learning more than anything else. And fascinatingly, listening and learning are really the core properties of the discipline of anthropology, and part of how I see its value in the coming century, and all at the heart of the anthropological discipline. So, in conclusion, I'm thinking back briefly to some words. In 1999, on my first visit to the Arabian Peninsula, I was far away from the nearest town with a few colleagues and interviewing a Bedouin pastoral nomad, aging Bedouin pastoral nomad, with the help of a translator deep in the desert. And we were talking about America. And he said to me that we Americans really need to figure out that it's just our turn simply to take our place amongst the others. I'm paraphrasing, but I think those are apt words, and words that I'd like to conclude with, that we Americans can staunch our imperialist tendencies by simply taking our place next to the others. Some humility. And so that brings my lecture to a close. I welcome any comments, suggestions that you may have, and I'll look forward to catching your ear in the near future. Thanks.